Behind the golden gates of Kensington Palace, where centuries of royal secrets have been carefully guarded, a discovery was about to shatter the careful facade that the monarchy had spent decades building. Prince William, the future King of England, was about to uncover something that would test every principle he had been taught about duty, family, and the crown he was destined to wear. It was a Tuesday morning in March 2023 when a single document, buried deep within palace archives, would transform the heir to the throne from a dutiful son into a man willing to challenge the very institution that shaped his entire existence. The discovery would send shockwaves through Buckingham Palace, leaving senior royals scrambling to contain what many would later call the most explosive confrontation in modern royal history. What Prince William found that day wasn't just evidence of deception. It was proof that everything he had believed about his family, his role, and his future had been built on carefully constructed lies. The man who had always been seen as the steady, reliable future of the monarchy was about to show a side of himself that would leave even his closest advisors stunned. This is the story of how one moment of truth ignited a fire that threatened to burn down centuries of royal tradition, and how a prince's fury became the catalyst for changes that would reshape the British royal family forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished floors of Kensington Palace as Prince William made his way through the corridors he had walked countless times since childhood. It was March 15, 2023, and what should have been a routine day reviewing documents for the upcoming coronation of his father, King Charles III, would instead become the day that changed everything he thought he knew about his family. William had always been the dutiful son, the responsible heir who understood the weight of his future crown. At 40 years old, he had spent his entire life preparing for the moment when he would one day rule Britain and the Commonwealth realms. His marriage to Catherine had been celebrated worldwide. His children were beloved by the public, and his charitable work had earned him respect both within and outside royal circles. He was, by all accounts, the perfect future king. The Prince of Wales had arrived at his office early that morning, as was his custom. His private secretary, James Harrison, had laid out the day's schedule, along with several boxes of historical documents that needed his review for the coronation ceremony. These archives, some dating back decades, contained protocols, precedents, and procedures that would ensure every detail of his father's crowning was handled with the appropriate dignity and respect for tradition. As William settled into his mahogany desk chair, the same chair that had once belonged to his great-grandfather, King George VI, he began methodically working through the documents. Most were exactly what he expected: detailed descriptions of ceremonial procedures, lists of invited dignitaries, and correspondence between palace officials about various aspects of the event. The work was tedious but necessary, and William approached it with his characteristic attention to detail. It was nearly 11 o'clock when he reached for a manila folder marked Private Correspondence, Historical Context. The folder was thicker than the others, and when he opened it, he found a collection of letters, memoranda, and reports that spanned nearly 3 decades. Most appeared to be communications between senior members of the royal household, palace officials, and government representatives. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. William had seen similar collections before, archived communications that provided insight into how past royal events had been managed. But as he began reading more carefully, certain phrases and references began to catch his attention. There were mentions of containment strategies, public perception management, and narrative control that seemed oddly specific and coordinated. One document, a memorandum dated August 1997, immediately drew his focus. The timing alone was significant. August 1997 was the month his mother, Princess Diana, had died in that tragic car accident in Paris. But as William read the contents of the memo, his hands began to tremble. The document outlined detailed plans for managing the public response to what it referred to as the anticipated incident, and included strategies for controlling media coverage and public sentiment. The memo was signed by several high-ranking palace officials, including some who had been close advisors to his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II. But what truly shocked William was the clinical, almost detached tone of the document. It read less like a response to a tragedy and more like a carefully orchestrated public relations campaign that had been planned in advance. William set the memo aside and continued reading, hoping to find context that would explain what he had just discovered. Instead, he found more documents that only deepened his confusion and growing sense of unease. There were detailed analyses of his mother's public appearances in the weeks leading up to her death, assessments of her threat level to the monarchy's stability, and even discussions about the potential benefits of her absence from public life. One particularly disturbing document was a psychological profile of Diana, commissioned by palace officials and conducted without her knowledge. The profile painted her as increasingly unstable, prone to emotional outbursts, and a significant risk to the institution's reputation. The language was cruel and calculating, describing the mother William remembered as loving, passionate, and genuine, as though she were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be protected. As William continued reading, he found evidence of a coordinated campaign to discredit Diana's public statements about the royal family. Her famous interview with Martin Bashir, in which she had spoken about her struggles within the monarchy, was referenced in multiple documents as damage that needed to be contained. The papers outlined strategies for undermining her credibility and portrayed her honest accounts of her experiences as the fabrications of a troubled woman. The more William read, the more his shock transformed into something else. A burning anger that started deep in his chest and spread through his entire body. These weren't just administrative documents. They were evidence of a systematic effort to isolate, discredit, and ultimately silence his mother. The very people who had been charged with protecting the royal family had instead been working to destroy one of its members. Among the most damaging documents was a series of communications between palace officials and media contacts, revealing a coordinated effort to plant negative stories about Diana in the British press. The palace had been actively feeding information to journalists, much of it false or taken out of context, designed to paint Diana as an unreliable, attention-seeking figure who posed a threat to the monarchy's stability. William discovered detailed records of payments made to various media figures, arrangements for exclusive interviews that would present the palace's preferred narrative, and even discussions about how to handle Diana's relationships with her sons. There were cold, calculating assessments of how her death might affect public perception of the royal family, and strategies for ensuring that any potential fallout would be minimized. One document that particularly enraged William was a proposal for rehabilitating the Windsor brand following Diana's death. The paper outlined plans for gradually shifting public sympathy away from Diana and back toward the royal institution, including strategies for using William and Harry's grief as a tool for generating public support. The document suggested that the prince's pain could be leveraged to create a narrative of a strong royal family united in tragedy, effectively using their mother's death as a public relations opportunity. The clinical language of these documents was what struck William most forcefully. His mother's death, his and Harry's devastation, the public's grief, all of it was discussed in terms of opportunities, challenges, and strategic considerations. There was no acknowledgement of the human cost, no recognition of the pain and trauma that real people had experienced. The documents read like corporate strategy papers, not communications about a family tragedy. As William sat in his office, surrounded by these revelations, he felt the careful composure he had maintained his entire life beginning to crack. The institution he had been raised to serve, the family legacy he had been taught to protect, had been built on lies and manipulation. The people he had trusted, the advisors who had guided him, had been complicit in a campaign against his own mother. The afternoon sun was beginning to fade when William finally closed the last folder. He sat in silence for several minutes, processing what he had learned and trying to understand the full implications of these discoveries. Everything he thought he knew about his mother's final years, about the circumstances of her death, about the royal family's response to the tragedy, had been a carefully constructed fiction. But perhaps most devastating of all was the realization that this deception had continued long after Diana's death. William began to understand that many of the facts he had been told about his mother, many of the explanations he had been given for various events and decisions, had been shaped by this same institutional machinery. His grief had been manipulated, his understanding of his mother's life had been distorted, and his relationship with his own family history had been based on lies. The documents also revealed ongoing efforts to prevent certain information about Diana from becoming public. There were references to sealed files, suppressed investigations, and coordinated efforts to discredit anyone who attempted to challenge the official narrative of events. The palace had not simply responded to Diana's death. It had actively worked to control how that death was understood and remembered. William realized that his discovery was not just about the past. It was about the present and future as well. The same institutional mechanisms that had been used against his mother were still in place, still operating, still capable of being deployed against anyone who was seen as a threat to the monarchy's carefully managed image. The very people who now advised him, who helped shape his public role, were part of an organization that had systematically worked to destroy his mother's reputation and legacy. As the day drew to a close, William carefully gathered all the documents and secured them in his personal safe. He knew that he was now in possession of information that could shake the very foundations of the British monarchy. But he also knew that he needed time to think, to plan, and to decide how to use what he had learned. The dutiful prince who had walked into his office that morning was gone. In his place sat a man who had been forced to confront the darkest secrets of the institution he was destined to lead. A man who now understood that his entire life had been shaped by lies and manipulation. The discovery had changed him fundamentally, and there would be no going back to the comfortable ignorance he had lived with for so many years. That night, as William drove home to Catherine and their children, he knew that everything had changed. The documents in his safe represented more than just historical evidence. They were proof that the very heart of the monarchy was rotten, built on deception and maintained through manipulation. And now, for the first time in his life, the future King of England was preparing to fight back against the institution that had raised him, shaped him, and ultimately betrayed everything he held dear. The confrontation that would follow would test every relationship William had, challenge every assumption he had held about duty and loyalty, and ultimately force him to choose between the crown he was born to wear and the truth he had finally discovered. The discovery was complete, but the real battle was just beginning. The week following William's discovery passed in a blur of careful investigation and growing determination. He had barely slept since finding those documents, his mind racing with questions that demanded answers. Catherine had noticed his changed demeanor immediately, but William wasn't ready to share what he had learned. Not yet. First, he needed to understand the full scope of what he was dealing with. Using his access to palace archives and his authority as heir to the throne, William began a methodical investigation into the documents he had discovered. He couldn't risk involving his usual staff, knowing that many of them might be connected to the very system he was now questioning. Instead, he reached out to Dr. Margaret Ashworth, a trusted historian who had worked independently with the royal collection for years, and whose loyalty was to historical truth rather than institutional protection. Dr. Ashworth arrived at Kensington Palace on a gray Tuesday morning, expecting to discuss preparations for an upcoming historical exhibition. Instead, William presented her with copies of selected documents, carefully chosen to reveal the scope of the deception without immediately exposing the most damaging evidence. He watched her face carefully as she read, seeing her professional composure gradually give way to shock and disbelief. "Your Royal Highness," she said quietly after reviewing the materials, "these documents suggest a level of institutional coordination that goes far beyond normal palace management. If these are authentic," she paused, clearly struggling with the implications. "This represents a systematic campaign of deception that would constitute one of the greatest scandals in modern royal history." William nodded grimly. "I need you to help me verify their authenticity and understand their full context. But Dr. Ashworth, I must stress that this investigation requires absolute discretion. I have reason to believe that the same mechanisms described in these documents may still be operational." Over the following days, Dr. Prepera Ashworth worked with William to authenticate the documents using forensic techniques and cross-referencing with known historical records. Every test confirmed what William had feared. The documents were genuine, the signatures were authentic, and the letterheads were legitimate. The evidence was irrefutable. As they dug deeper, more disturbing patterns emerged. The campaign against Diana had not been an isolated incident, but part of a broader strategy for managing problematic royal family members. They found evidence of similar tactics being used against other royals who had challenged institutional norms or threatened to expose uncomfortable truths. The palace had developed what amounted to a playbook for character assassination, media manipulation, and public opinion management. William discovered that his own public image had been carefully crafted using some of the same techniques. His reputation as the steady heir had been deliberately cultivated to contrast with his mother's perceived instability. Press releases, photo opportunities, and even his educational and career choices had all been managed to present a specific narrative to the public. The realization that his entire public persona had been manufactured left him feeling hollow and manipulated. The most shocking discovery came when they uncovered evidence that these techniques were still being used in the present day. Recent documents showed ongoing efforts to manage media coverage of various royal family members, including coordinated campaigns to discredit certain journalists and suppress specific stories. The machinery that had been used against Diana was still operating, still capable of destroying reputations and lives. William realized that his brother Harry's dramatic departure from royal life made much more sense in this context. Harry had spoken publicly about feeling trapped by the institution, about being unable to protect his wife Meghan from the same forces that had tormented their mother. The official palace response had dismissed Harry's claims as exaggerated or misguided. But now William could see that his brother had been trying to escape the very system that William was just beginning to understand. The investigation also revealed the extent to which information had been withheld from William himself. As the heir to the throne, he had assumed he was being kept informed about important matters affecting the royal family. Instead, he discovered that crucial information had been filtered, distorted, or completely hidden from him. Decisions that affected his life, his family, and his future role had been made without his knowledge or input. One particularly painful discovery was evidence that his own staff had been reporting his activities, conversations, and even private opinions to senior palace officials. People he had trusted, individuals he had considered friends and advisors, had been systematically gathering information about him and sharing it with others who used it to manage and manipulate his public role. The betrayal was personal as well as institutional. As William learned more about the scope of the deception, his anger evolved into something more focused and determined. He began to understand that this wasn't just about his mother or his family. It was about the fundamental nature of the monarchy itself. The institution he had been raised to serve was built on lies, maintained through manipulation, and sustained by the destruction of anyone who threatened its carefully managed image. Dr. Ashworth helped him understand the historical context of these revelations. The monarchy had always been involved in managing its public image, but the documents suggested that this management had evolved into something far more sinister and comprehensive. The palace had essentially created a parallel information system designed to control public perception regardless of truth or the human cost of that control. William also began to piece together how this system had affected other members of his family. His father, now King Charles III, had been both a beneficiary and a victim of these same tactics. Charles's own struggles with public perception, particularly during his marriage to Diana and in the aftermath of her death, had been managed through the same mechanisms. William wondered how much his father knew about the full extent of these operations. The investigation revealed that Queen Elizabeth II had been aware of at least some of these activities, though the extent of her knowledge and approval remained unclear. Documents suggested that she had been briefed on major operations but may not have understood their full implications or methods. The picture that emerged was of an institution that had gradually assumed more and more power over royal family members' lives, operating with increasing autonomy and decreasing oversight. As William learned about the sophisticated methods used to manipulate public opinion, he began to understand how deeply these techniques had penetrated British media and society. The palace had cultivated relationships with journalists, editors, and media owners, creating a network of influence that extended far beyond formal royal communications. Stories were planted, narratives were shaped, and public opinion was manufactured through coordinated campaigns that operated largely in secret. The investigation also uncovered financial aspects of these operations. Significant sums of money had been spent on public relations firms, media consultants, and other external agencies that specialized in reputation management and crisis communication. Much of this spending had been hidden within broader palace budgets, making it difficult to track or scrutinize. William discovered that his mother had not been entirely unaware of what was happening to her. Among the documents were her own attempts to gather evidence and understand the campaigns being waged against her. Diana had compiled her own files, conducted her own investigations, and even reached out to journalists and activists who might help her expose the truth. Her efforts had been systematically undermined and discredited, but they showed that she had fought back against the forces arrayed against her. Perhaps most troubling was evidence that these operations had continued after Diana's death, working to shape public memory and understanding of her life and legacy. The palace had actively worked to minimize her influence and importance, ensuring that her criticisms of the royal family would be dismissed as the products of emotional instability rather than legitimate concerns about institutional behavior. As the investigation continued, William realized that he was not just dealing with historical injustices, but with ongoing threats. The same people who had orchestrated campaigns against his mother were still in positions of power and influence. They had the capability and apparent willingness to use similar tactics against anyone who threatened their control, including William himself. The weight of this knowledge was overwhelming. William found himself questioning every aspect of his life and role within the royal family. How many of his own decisions had been influenced by false information or manipulated circumstances? How many opportunities had he missed to protect other family members because he didn't understand what was really happening? How much of his public support was genuine versus manufactured through sophisticated manipulation techniques? Dr. Ashworth helped him understand that his discovery represented a crucial turning point. The information he now possessed could be used to expose and dismantle the systems that had caused so much harm, but doing so would require enormous courage and would likely face fierce resistance from entrenched interests within the palace establishment. As William contemplated his next steps, he realized that he was facing the most important decision of his life. He could choose to remain silent, to protect the institution and his own future role by allowing these systems to continue operating. Or he could choose to fight back, to use his position and the evidence he had gathered to force fundamental changes, knowing that such a choice would likely make him a target of the very forces he was challenging. The investigation had revealed the full scope of the deception and manipulation that had shaped his family's life for decades. Now William had to decide what he was going to do with that knowledge. The dutiful prince who had always put duty above personal concerns was about to make a choice that would define not just his own future, but the future of the British monarchy itself. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test every principle William had been taught about loyalty, duty, and service. The investigation was complete, and now the real battle was about to begin. The morning of March 28, 2023 dawned crisp and clear over Buckingham Palace. Inside the grand walls that had witnessed centuries of royal drama, another chapter was about to unfold that would be remembered as one of the most explosive confrontations in modern royal history. Prince William, armed with irrefutable evidence and steeled by weeks of investigation, was prepared to challenge the very foundations of the institution he had been born to inherit. William had carefully planned this confrontation. He had requested a private meeting with his father, King Charles III, under the pretext of discussing coronation preparations. But he had also ensured that several key figures would be present: Sir Clive Alderton, the King's private secretary, Dame Angela Kelly, who had served as Queen Elizabeth II's personal assistant and dresser, and Lord Geit, the former private secretary who had been deeply involved in palace operations during the period covered by the documents William had discovered. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. in the King's private study, a room that had seen countless discussions about the future of the monarchy. As William walked through the corridors of Buckingham Palace that afternoon, he carried with him a leather briefcase containing copies of the most damaging documents from his investigation. Each piece of paper represented not just evidence of past wrongdoing, but proof that the institution they all served had been built on systematic deception and manipulation. King Charles was already seated behind his ornate desk when William arrived, flanked by his senior advisors. The atmosphere in the room was formal but relaxed, with everyone expecting a routine discussion about ceremonial details and logistics. Charles greeted his son warmly, inquiring about Catherine and the grandchildren before gesturing for everyone to take their seats around the conference table that dominated one side of the study. "I appreciate everyone making time for this meeting," William began, his voice steady despite the gravity of what he was about to reveal. "However, I must inform you that this discussion will not be about coronation preparations. Instead, I need to address a matter of far greater importance to the future of this institution and our family." The change in William's tone immediately caught everyone's attention. Sir Clive leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious, while Dame Angela exchanged a quick glance with Lord Geit. Charles himself seemed puzzled but remained composed, waiting for his son to continue. William opened his briefcase and carefully placed a stack of documents on the table. 3 weeks ago, while reviewing historical files for the coronation ceremony, I discovered these documents. They detail systematic campaigns of deception, manipulation, and character assassination that have been conducted by senior palace officials over the past 3 decades. Most significantly, they provide irrefutable evidence of a coordinated effort to discredit, isolate, and ultimately silence my mother. The silence that followed was deafening. Charles's face went pale as he recognized some of the documents William was displaying. Sir Clive's usual composure cracked slightly, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Dame Angela sat completely still, her eyes fixed on the papers before her. Lord Geit's expression was unreadable, but William noticed his jaw tighten as he surveyed the evidence. "These documents," William continued, his voice gaining strength and intensity, "reveal that the tragic narrative we were all told about my mother's final years, that she was unstable, unreliable, and posed a threat to the monarchy, was deliberately manufactured by this very office. They show that palace officials systematically fed false information to the media, commissioned psychological profiles without her consent, and even planned strategies for managing public response to what they called the anticipated incident." Charles finally found his voice. "William, I understand you're upset, but surely you're misinterpreting." "I am not misinterpreting anything." William cut him off, his tone sharper than anyone in the room had ever heard from the usually diplomatic prince. "I have had these documents verified by independent experts. I have cross-referenced them with media reports from the period. I have traced payments and communications. This is not a misunderstanding or a misinterpretation. This is evidence of institutionalized cruelty and deception." William began reading directly from one of the memos, his voice steady but filled with controlled fury. Quote, "The subject continues to present challenges to institutional stability through her public statements and media engagements. Recommend implementing comprehensive containment strategy, including coordinated media placement and strategic relationship management. This subject they're referring to was my mother, the woman who died in that tunnel in Paris while being pursued by photographers who had been fed information by these very people." Dame Angela finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your Royal Highness, the circumstances of that time were extraordinarily complex. The princess's situation required careful management to protect the institution." William turned to face her directly, his eyes blazing with anger. "Protect the institution from what? Exactly? From the truth? From accountability? From a woman who had the courage to speak about her experiences within this family?" He pulled out another document, this one bearing Lord Geit's signature. "This memo outlines specific strategies for undermining my mother's credibility following her Panorama interview. It includes plans for portraying her as mentally unstable, and suggests ways to use her relationship with Harry and me as leverage against her. You were willing to weaponize our childhood trauma to protect your reputation." Lord Geit shifted uncomfortably in his chair but maintained his composure. "Your Royal Highness, we were operating under extraordinary circumstances. The monarchy faced unprecedented challenges, and difficult decisions had to be made to ensure its survival." "Survival?" William's voice rose for the first time, his famous composure finally cracking. "You call the systematic destruction of a human being's reputation survival. You call using children's grief as a public relations tool survival. What you call survival, I call moral bankruptcy." Charles attempted to regain control of the situation. "William, I understand your anger, but we need to consider the broader context." "The broader context," William interrupted, standing up from his chair, "is that this institution has operated like a criminal organization for decades. You've destroyed lives, manipulated public opinion, and corrupted the very idea of service and duty that you claim to represent." William began pacing around the room, his anger building with each word. Do you want to know what the most devastating part of this discovery has been for me? It's not just learning about what was done to my mother, though that is heartbreaking enough. It's realizing that everything I was raised to believe about this family, about our role, about our values, was built on lies. He stopped pacing and faced the group directly. I was taught that we serve the British people, that we represent the best of our nation's values, that we stand for truth, honor, and integrity. But these documents show that we've done the opposite. We've lied, manipulated, and destroyed anyone who threatened our carefully manufactured image. Sir Clive attempted to respond. Your Royal Highness, these operations were designed to protect. Protect who? William demanded. Because they certainly didn't protect my mother. They didn't protect Harry when he tried to escape this same system. They didn't even protect me, because I've discovered that my own staff has been reporting my private conversations and activities to your office for years. The revelation about surveillance of William himself sent another shockwave through the room. Charles looked genuinely stunned, clearly unaware that his son's activities had been monitored. William, I had no knowledge of any surveillance. Of course you didn't, William replied bitterly. Because this system operates independently of the actual royal family. You're not the head of this institution, Father. You're just another asset to be managed by these people who have convinced themselves that they're protecting something more important than the human beings whose lives they destroy. William returned to the documents, pulling out a particularly damaging memo. This document outlines plans for managing my grief following my mother's death. It includes specific strategies for using my emotional state to generate public sympathy for the royal family and suggests ways to ensure that my public statements would serve institutional interests rather than reflect my actual feelings. The room fell silent as the full implications of William's words sank in. Charles looked devastated as he began to understand the scope of the deception that had surrounded his family for years. The senior advisors remained quiet, their usual confidence shaken by the methodical way William was dismantling their justifications. I want to know who authorized these operations, William continued, his voice now dangerously quiet. I want to know who signed off on the destruction of my mother's reputation. I want to know who decided that using children's trauma was an acceptable tool for protecting this institution's image. Lord Geit cleared his throat. Your Royal Highness, these decisions were made collectively, in consultation with senior government officials and with the knowledge of Her late Majesty. We were operating under extraordinary pressure. Don't you dare invoke my grandmother's memory to justify this, William shot back. I've found evidence suggesting that information was withheld from her, that she was given carefully curated briefings designed to support predetermined conclusions. She may have approved certain actions, but she was making decisions based on false or incomplete information provided by the very people who had created the crises they claimed to be managing. William walked over to his father, placing both hands on the desk and leaning forward. Father, I need to know how much you knew about this. I need to know whether you were complicit in these operations, or whether you were another victim of this system's manipulation. Charles met his son's gaze, and for a moment the formal roles of king and heir fell away, leaving just a father and son grappling with devastating truths. William, I swear to you that I did not know the full extent of what was being done. I knew there were efforts to manage media coverage and public perception, but I never imagined anything like what you're describing. But you benefited from it. William pointed out, your public rehabilitation after the divorce, the careful management of public opinion regarding Camilla, the gradual restoration of your reputation. All of that was achieved using the same techniques that were used to destroy my mother. The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Charles looked stricken as he began to understand how his own improved public standing had been built on the systematic undermining of his first wife's reputation and credibility. William straightened up and addressed the entire room. I want immediate resignations from everyone who was involved in these operations. I want a complete audit of current palace communications and public relations activities. And I want a full disclosure of all documents related to these campaigns, not just the ones I've happened to discover. Sir Clive finally found his voice. Your Royal Highness, with respect, you don't have the authority to demand resignations or order audits. These are matters for His Majesty to decide. William turned to his father with an expression of grim determination. Then I'm asking you, Father, as your heir, and as your son, to make those decisions. Either we clean house and fundamentally reform how this institution operates, or I will have no choice but to take this evidence public and let the British people decide for themselves whether the monarchy deserves their continued support. The threat was clear and unprecedented. No heir to the throne had ever openly threatened to expose the monarchy's secrets or to challenge its continued existence. Charles realized that his son was not bluffing, that William was prepared to sacrifice his own future role rather than be complicit in the continuation of the system he had discovered. "William," Charles said quietly, "if this information becomes public, it could destroy the monarchy entirely. Everything we've worked to build, everything your grandmother devoted her life to preserving, could be lost." William's response was immediate and unwavering. "Then perhaps it deserves to be lost. If this institution can only survive through lies, manipulation, and the destruction of innocent people, then maybe the British people would be better off without it." The confrontation had reached its climax. William had laid out his demands and his ultimatum. The senior advisors who had run these operations for decades were facing the prospect of exposure and disgrace. Charles was being forced to choose between protecting the institution he had waited his entire life to lead and supporting his son's demand for fundamental reform. As the meeting concluded, it was clear that nothing would ever be the same. William had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. He had challenged not just specific actions or individuals, but the entire system that had shaped the modern monarchy. The dutiful prince was gone, replaced by a man determined to either reform the institution he would inherit or see it fall, rather than perpetuate its crimes. The confrontation was over, but its consequences were just beginning to unfold. The 48 hours following William's explosive confrontation with senior palace officials would be remembered as the most turbulent period in modern royal history. Word of the meeting had spread quickly through the tight-knit community of palace staff, creating an atmosphere of crisis that permeated every level of the royal household. For the first time in living memory, the heir to the throne had not only challenged the institution's authority, but had threatened to expose its darkest secrets to the world. King Charles spent the night after the confrontation in his private quarters, struggling with the devastating revelations his son had presented. The documents William had shown him painted a picture of systematic deception that challenged everything Charles thought he knew about his own family's history and his role within the monarchy. He found himself questioning decisions he had made, relationships he had trusted, and the very foundation of the institution he had finally inherited after waiting 7 decades to rule. By dawn on March 29th, Charles had made his decision. Rather than risk the complete destruction of the monarchy through public exposure, he would meet William's demands for reform. But implementing such changes would require careful planning and delicate negotiations with entrenched interests who had operated with virtual autonomy for years. The king's first action was to request the immediate resignation of Lord Guyt, whose signature appeared on some of the most damaging documents William had discovered. The resignation was announced as a routine personnel change, but those within palace circles understood its true significance. For the first time, a senior royal advisor was being held accountable for operations that had previously been considered untouchable. Sir Clive Alderton's position was more complex. While he had been involved in recent operations that continued the problematic patterns revealed in the historical documents, Charles recognized that completely dismantling his senior staff would create operational chaos during the crucial period leading up to his coronation. Instead, he chose to place Alderton under careful scrutiny while beginning the process of identifying potential replacements. Dame Angela Kelly presented a different challenge entirely. Her intimate knowledge of royal family operations and her decades of service made her both a valuable asset and a potential threat. Charles decided to offer her early retirement with full honors, a move that would remove her from active operations while avoiding the appearance of a purge that might raise uncomfortable questions from the media. Meanwhile, William had not been idle. Following the confrontation, he had immediately reached out to his brother Harry in California, sharing selected portions of his discoveries and offering what amounted to a formal apology for not understanding the forces that had driven Harry to leave the royal family. The conversation between the brothers, their first meaningful communication in over a year, lasted nearly 3 hours and marked the beginning of a tentative reconciliation. Harry's response was a mixture of vindication and sadness. He had suspected for years that organized campaigns were being conducted against him and Meghan, but he had never imagined the scope and sophistication of the operations William was describing. The evidence William presented finally explained many of the coordinated attacks they had faced, the systematic undermining of their charitable work, and the seemingly impossible task of correcting false narratives once they had taken hold in the media. "I tried to tell you," Harry said during their video call. "I tried to warn you about what they were doing, but I couldn't prove it. I'm sorry it took this long for you to see it, but I'm grateful you finally understand what we were fighting against." The brothers began discussing the possibility of Harry's eventual return to royal duties, though both understood that such a reconciliation would require fundamental changes in how the royal family operated. For William, his brother's potential return represented not just a personal healing, but a powerful symbol of the institutional reforms he was demanding. Catherine had initially been shocked by William's revelations, struggling to understand how the family she had married into could have been capable of such systematic deception. But as William shared more details of his investigation, she began to see connections to her own experiences within the royal family. She remembered subtle pressures to modify her public statements, suggestions about which charitable causes she should support, and carefully orchestrated media opportunities that she had thought were simple publicity arrangements. The Princess of Wales became one of William's strongest supporters in his push for reform, bringing her own insights about how palace operations affected female members of the royal family. Her perspective helped William understand that the tactics used against his mother were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader pattern of controlling and managing royal women who might threaten established hierarchies. As news of the internal crisis began to leak to select members of the British media, palace communication staff found themselves in an impossible position. They were being asked to develop strategies for managing a story they couldn't fully acknowledge or deny, while simultaneously knowing that their own operational methods were under scrutiny. Several senior communications officials quietly began updating their resumes and reaching out to contacts in the private sector. The government, through the cabinet secretary, was quickly briefed on the developing situation. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak found himself facing a constitutional crisis unlike any in recent British history. The monarchy's stability was fundamental to Britain's governmental structure, but the evidence William had uncovered suggested institutional corruption that could undermine public faith in the crown entirely. Government legal advisors were consulted about the potential implications of William's threatened disclosure. While the heir to the throne had certain legal protections that would make prosecution unlikely, the political ramifications of royal family secrets becoming public could be devastating for both the monarchy and the government that depended on its constitutional role. Back at Kensington Palace, William was working with Dr. Ashworth and a small team of trusted advisors to develop a comprehensive reform proposal that would address the systemic problems his investigation had revealed. The plan included the establishment of independent oversight mechanisms for palace operations, mandatory disclosure of media relationships and financial arrangements, and clear protocols for protecting royal family members from institutional retaliation. The reform proposal also addressed the historical injustices revealed by William's investigation. He demanded that his mother's reputation be formally rehabilitated through official acknowledgement of the campaigns conducted against her. This would include public recognition that many of the negative narratives about Diana had been deliberately manufactured and that her criticisms of royal family operations had been legitimate rather than the products of emotional instability. One of the most controversial aspects of William's reform agenda was his insistence on accountability for past actions. He wanted formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing, apologies to affected family members, and assurances that those responsible for the most egregious operations would face consequences for their actions. This demand created significant resistance from entrenched palace interests, who feared that admitting past mistakes would open the institution to legal challenges and ongoing scrutiny. The international implications of the crisis were becoming apparent as well. The British monarchy served as head of state for multiple Commonwealth realms, and constitutional crises in London could trigger political instability in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and other nations that recognize the British Crown. Diplomatic communications began flowing between London and Commonwealth capitals as governments prepared for potential constitutional changes. William's investigation had also revealed the international scope of palace operations. Documents showed coordination with foreign media outlets, relationships with international public relations firms, and efforts to manage royal family coverage in global markets. The revelation that British royal family image management extended far beyond the UK raised questions about sovereignty and influence that complicated the diplomatic response to the crisis. As the first week after the confrontation concluded, it became clear that William's demands were creating fundamental changes in palace operations even before formal reforms were implemented. Staff members who had operated with virtual autonomy for years found themselves under unprecedented scrutiny. Decision-making processes that had been informal and secretive were being documented and reviewed. The entire culture of the royal household was shifting as the reality of accountability began to take hold. The media, while not yet aware of the specific details of William's discoveries, had begun to sense that something significant was happening within the royal family. Increased security around palace communications, unusual patterns of staff movement, and the sudden resignation of senior advisors were generating speculation about internal conflicts and potential scandals. Royal correspondents who had developed close relationships with palace sources found their usual channels of information suddenly closed off. The careful system of unofficial briefings and strategic leaks that had characterized royal media relations for decades was being dismantled as William's team worked to identify and eliminate the mechanisms that had been used to manipulate coverage. William himself was experiencing profound personal changes as he grappled with the implications of his discoveries. The comfortable certainties that had guided his life for 40 years had been shattered, replaced by a deep skepticism about institutional authority and a determination to use his position to prevent future abuses. The dutiful prince who had never questioned palace authority was gone, replaced by a reformer who was prepared to challenge every aspect of how the monarchy operated. The relationship between William and his father remained strained as they navigated the complex process of implementing reforms while maintaining the appearance of institutional stability. Charles found himself caught between his son's demands for immediate change and the practical realities of managing a constitutional monarchy during a period of unprecedented internal crisis. As April began, the full scope of William's ultimatum was becoming clear to everyone involved in royal operations. The heir to the throne was not seeking minor adjustments or cosmetic changes to palace procedures. He was demanding a fundamental transformation of the monarchy that would eliminate the secretive, manipulative culture that had operated for decades and replace it with transparent, accountable systems that served the public interest rather than institutional self-preservation. The question that remained was whether such transformation was possible without destroying the institution entirely. William had forced the royal family to confront its darkest secrets and had demanded that they choose between meaningful reform and potential annihilation. The monarchy that emerged from this crisis would be fundamentally different from the one that had existed before, assuming it survived at all. The battle for the soul of the British royal family had begun, and its outcome would determine not just the future of the monarchy, but the character of British constitutional democracy itself. William had lit a fire that threatened to consume everything, but from those ashes might emerge an institution finally worthy of the trust and respect of the people it claimed to serve. The confrontation was over, but the revolution it had sparked was just beginning.